There are certain moments in life where time seems to split into two parts: life before a moment and life after it. For millions of people every year, that moment arrives in the form of three words most never expected to hear about themselves: you have cancer. People usually remember it with incredible clarity. They remember the tone of the physician's voice. They may remember what the room smelled like or what they were wearing that day. Some people may get advanced warning that the diagnosis news may be coming. They often try to imagine that moment before it happens. They imagine they will respond in a clear, composed way. Maybe they will ask thoughtful questions. Maybe they will cry. Maybe they will stay calm and absorb every detail the physician explains. Yet, when the moment actually arrives, the experience is often very different. For most, the first feeling is not clarity, it is shock. Shock can pummel silence into your body and into your brain. The physician may still be talking, the room may still look the same, but internally, everything suddenly feels distant and surreal. Most people will often say they can remember the exact phrase that changed everything, yet interestingly, don't remember most of what was actually said after that diagnosis. And there's a reason for that. The shock of a cancer diagnosis. The brain just simply cannot process that much emotion and information all at once. So let's talk about it. This is the After Cancer Podcast. I'm your host, oncology physical therapist, Dr. Leslie Waltke. For more than 3 decades, I've walked alongside people living with and beyond cancer. Whether you are a survivor, a caregiver, or part of a clinical team who cares for them, I'm glad you're here. Because life after a cancer diagnosis can feel uncharted and confusing, even when you have a great medical team. In this podcast, evidence, empathy, and the real human experience come together to help you navigate the physical, emotional, and practical realities of cancer and the life that comes after. This is the After Cancer Podcast, rooted in medicine, spoken in human. Welcome to episode 5, Why Your Brain Stops Processing After a Cancer Diagnosis. The moment life splits in two. We're going to talk about something that almost everyone experiences, but very few people explain. The shock of a diagnosis. The moment someone hears the words, "you have cancer." In earlier episodes of this podcast, we explored how language and labels can shape identity after diagnosis in episode 1. We talked in episode 3 about the ways people sometimes compare their cancer experiences with others. And in episode 4, we discussed the hypervigilant body, where survivors feel constantly alert to sensations that might signal danger. But before all of those experiences unfold, there is always a beginning. There is always a moment when someone first learns that cancer has entered their life. That moment often leaves a deep imprint on memory, on the nervous system, and on the emotional story people carry about their illness. So what actually happens in the brain and body when you hear those words? Why can it feel impossible to process information? Why the emotional shockwave that follows can be so overwhelming? And here's another really hard part of a cancer diagnosis. It's the moment when you realize you now have to tell other people. We'll talk about the science, the psychology, and the human side of all of these moments. And at the end, we'll also talk about something incredibly important: how you survivors can help someone else when they find themselves standing at the beginning of that same terrifying road. Because unfortunately, cancer diagnoses are not rare. And someday, someone you care about may hear those same words. The moment life splits in two. For many people, the moment they hear the word cancer becomes a permanent bookmark in their life story. Sometimes it happens in an exam room. Sometimes it happens over the phone. Sometimes it happens after weeks of testing and waiting. Some people learn about the diagnosis through a patient portal message before they have even spoken to a physician directly. One survivor once told me she was standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store when her phone rang. The nurse on the other end of the line said gently, "Your biopsy results are back, and it's cancer." She said the entire store suddenly felt like it tilted sideways. The lights seemed brighter, the sounds around her louder, and for a moment she could not remember why she had come to the store in the first place. Another patient described sitting quietly in an exam room while her physician explained that the imaging results were concerning. She remembers staring at the physician's shoes because she could not bring herself to look at his face. She later realized she had no memory of how the conversation ended or how she walked out of the clinic. These reactions are incredibly common. However the news arrives, the emotional impact is typically profound. Many describe the moment in similar ways. Time slows down, the room feels different, and suddenly the future you had imagined just a few minutes earlier seems uncertain. People often describe the experience as if the ground was suddenly dropped out beneath them. And in many ways, that description is incredibly accurate. When the brain detects a threat, whether it's a physical threat or a perceived existential threat, a structure deep inside our brain called the amygdala becomes activated. The amygdala is part of the brain's threat detection system. Its job is to answer a very simple question: am I safe right now? When the brain hears the word cancer, it often interprets that information as a serious threat. The amygdala responds by activating the acute stress response. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol surge into the bloodstream. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, attention narrows, and the brain begins prioritizing survival. Here's where something interesting happens. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical thinking, decision making, and complex reasoning, becomes less active during high stress. So, in this state, the brain prioritizes survival over detailed thinking. Research in trauma psychology shows that when the brain enters acute stress mode, the ability to process complex information temporarily decreases. This is why many patients say they do not remember much of what the physician explained immediately after delivering the diagnosis. In other words, the very part of the brain we rely on to understand complicated medical information becomes less efficient at the exact moment we're asked to absorb the potentially most important information of our lives. This is why many patients say things like, "I remember the doctor saying cancer," and then everything else after that is a blur. Here, the brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect survival first and process details later. This reaction is not weakness, it is biology. So, what is happening in the body? Well, the shock of diagnosis is not just emotional, it is also physiological. Again, we've talked about how when the stress response activates, the body releases adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart rate increases, blood pressure may rise, breathing becomes faster and shallower. People may feel lightheaded, their mouth may become dry. Some people feel like they've left their body entirely. Others describe a sensation of tunnel hearing, where they can hear the doctor speaking but can't fully process the words. Some people nod along in the appointment even though they cannot fully understand what is being said. The body is responding exactly as it would respond to any perceived threat. The difference here, though, is that this threat is not a tiger in the room, it's information about the future. Now, another really hard part of the cancer diagnosis information processing moment is that it often arrives alongside an avalanche of information. In a single appointment, people may hear about biopsy results, cancer staging, treatment options, surgery timelines, chemotherapy plans, radiation therapy, side effects, and survival statistics. From a cognitive standpoint, this is an extraordinary amount of information. Even under calm circumstances, This is really, really hard stuff to process. But during the stress response, the brain's ability to absorb complex information is dramatically reduced. One patient once told me that when her doctor said the word cancer, she became completely fixated on a clock on the wall behind the doctor's head. She could see the second hand moving, but could not hear anything the doctor said for several minutes. Another patient described driving home from the hospital after a diagnosis and realizing halfway home that she had no memory of the drive itself. This is why many cancer centers and all of us in healthcare encourage patients to bring a support person to appointments, to listen, to take notes, and to review and debrief with you after. Very few people can fully understand a cancer treatment plan in the first conversation, and that's completely normal. In the hours and days after diagnosis, many people describe feeling as if they have entered an unfamiliar world. Suddenly, there are new, ridiculously long foreign words to learn. Pathology, staging, oncology consultations, treatment plans, biopsy, pathology reports. The healthcare system becomes central to daily life almost overnight. At the same time, people often feel pressure to make decisions quickly. Which surgeon, which hospital, what treatment plan is best? All of this can happen while you and your brain are still trying to process the emotional shock of the diagnosis itself. Many survivors say the first 72 hours after diagnosis feel surreal. Time moves strangely. Some moments feel painfully slow, while others pass in a blur. Sleep can be difficult. Concentration is nearly impossible. The mind keeps returning to the same thought again and again. How did this happen? We also have to acknowledge, too, the emotional shockwave. After the first few days of a new diagnosis or a diagnosis of progressive disease, emotions often arrive in waves. Fear, disbelief, anger, sadness, numbness. Sometimes all of these emotions appear within the same hour. Many people also experience something confusing. They may feel gratitude and terror all at the same time. Grateful that the cancer was discovered. Terrified of what happens next. Also, replaying the past is another common experience during the early days after diagnosis. People begin reviewing the weeks or months before the diagnosis and wondering if there was signs that they missed. They remember symptoms they ignored, appointments they had postponed, or unusual sensations they explained away at the time. Again, this is a normal psychological process. The brain is trying to build a story that makes sense of a shocking event. Humans naturally search for meaning when something disruptive occurs. Human emotions are complicated, and the cancer experience rarely fits neatly into emotional stages. Instead, people move back and forth between feelings as they begin navigating the reality of diagnosis. So please don't be hard on yourself if you are feeling any of this. A cancer diagnosis is never your fault. No one deserves it, and there is no right way to process the overwhelm of a new diagnosis. And then there's the hidden task, the burden of telling others. At some point after diagnosis, this realization arrives. You may now have to tell people, the people you love, a partner, a parent, a sibling, a close friend, your children, a boss. And suddenly you find yourself repeating the same sentence again and again. I have cancer. It's cancer. I was diagnosed with cancer. Each time you say it, you are now not only processing your own emotions, you are now also absorbing the reactions of the person hearing the news. Some people cry. Some people panic. Some people begin asking questions you cannot possibly answer yet. Others respond with intense reassurance that may feel good, but also may feel shallow and overwhelming. Many survivors say one of the most exhausting parts of the early diagnosis phase is managing the emotions of everyone around them. In those early days, people often feel like they are responsible for reassuring others while they themselves are still trying to understand what is happening. And this too can be incredibly overwhelming for your poor brain. Because once you begin telling people, you quickly discover that the story has to be repeated again and again. Each conversation requires emotional energy. Each conversation includes questions, and each conversation exposes you to another person's reaction. Again, some people react with compassion, some react with fear, some react with overwhelming emotion. And some may react with questions or comments that are unintentionally painful. Even figuring out who to tell and who not to tell can be tiring. One helpful way to think about this disclosure is through 3 circles: your inner circle, the functional circle, and the outer circle. The inner circle typically includes the people closest to you: partners, family members, trusted friends. The functional circle includes people who may need to know for logistical reasons: employers, coworkers, childcare providers. The outer circle includes acquaintances and broader community members. Important point to remember: you do not owe everyone immediate access to your diagnosis. You are allowed to take time and decide how and when to share the information. To help protect their emotional energy, many patients create systems for communication. Some designate a spokesperson who can share updates. Others create group text threads or email updates. These symptoms can reduce the emotional burden of repeating the same information dozens of times. It is also okay to set boundaries with simple statements like, "I'm still gathering information and will share updates when I know more." Or, "Right now, I just need some time to process." Maria was 42 when she was diagnosed with colon cancer. The diagnosis itself felt unreal, but what kept her awake at night wasn't the treatment plan, it was how to tell her 2 young children. For 2 days, she walked around the house rehearsing sentences in her head, like, "Mommy is sick. Mommy has cancer. Mommy is going to be okay." But none of the words felt right. She worried that the moment she said it out loud, their childhood innocence would fracture. When she did finally sit them down at the kitchen table, her 7-year-old interrupted halfway through and asked, "So is that why you've been going to so many doctor's appointments?" Maria realized in that moment that children often sense more than adults think, and that honestly, even when imperfect, sharing can be a relief for everyone. David is a 55-year-old teacher diagnosed with lymphoma. When he told his wife, she cried harder than he did. When he told his sister, she immediately began Googling survival statistics and reading them out loud. When he told his best friend, the best friend became silent and avoided him for weeks. David later described that period as having to absorb everyone else's emotions. Instead of people asking how he felt, he found himself reassuring them that they would be okay. For many patients, the emotional labor of managing other people's reactions becomes an unexpected second job. Angela is a project manager in a competitive corporate environment. When she learned she had breast cancer, she told me that she dreaded telling her boss more than she dreaded having the surgery. Would they see her as unreliable? Would opportunities disappear? When she finally scheduled the meeting with her boss, her voice shook as she explained that she would need time for treatment. Her boss leaned back, paused, and said, "Thank you for telling me. Let's figure out how we can support you." Angela later said that conversation changed everything. But the fear beforehand, the fear of how cancer might change how others see you professionally, is something that many patients quietly carry. Tom was diagnosed with prostate cancer and initially planned to tell only a few close friends. But once the first handful of conversations happened, the news began to spread quickly. Within a week, he was receiving texts, phone calls, casseroles, and long emotional messages from acquaintances he barely knew. Some were supportive, some were overwhelming. Tom realized that once the information leaves your mouth, you no longer have control of where it goes. Many patients describe this as the moment cancer becomes public. And sometimes that loss of privacy can feel surprisingly difficult. Lena was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and told only her partner for nearly a month. She continued working, meeting friends, and attending family gatherings without mentioning it. She later said it was the only way she could hold on to a sense of normal life for just a little while longer. Eventually, though, the logistics of treatment made secrecy pretty much impossible. But Lena often tells others newly diagnosed with cancer that it is okay to take time before sharing the news. You are allowed to process the diagnosis yourself before carrying everyone else's reactions. Then there are the stories that make your head spin. Just last week, a patient of mine came in for an appointment to see me in the PT clinic. She had taken a ride share to get there. As they were approaching the hospital, the driver asked what her appointment was for. When Diana honestly told her, the driver went into a full-on tirade of how what she had just done mutilated her body, and what she really just needed to do was eat kale and blueberries. Yes, that happened. Thankfully, Diana was able to mostly laugh it off, but still. All of these experiences are incredibly common. Cancer diagnosis is not just a medical event, it is a deeply human moment. So, moral of the story: protecting your emotional energy during diagnosis is not selfish, it is necessary. So, now let's talk the science. Research in trauma psychology and neuroscience supports many of these experiences. Acute stress activates the amygdala and suppresses prefrontal cortex activity. This impairs complex decision making. Cortisol and adrenaline alter attention, memory formation, and information processing. This is why, again, individuals experiencing acute stress often remember fragments of events rather than a full narrative. Psycho-oncology research has also shown that a cancer diagnosis is commonly associated with symptoms similar to acute stress reactions. Understanding these biological responses can help patients recognize that shock and confusion are normal physiological responses, not personal failures. If you are listening to this episode because you have recently been diagnosed with cancer, remember this. If your mind feels overwhelmed right now, that is normal. You do not have to understand everything today, as cancer care is a long road made up of many conversations and many steps. Clarity will come eventually. You are allowed to protect your emotional energy. You are allowed to move at your own pace. And if you are a survivor listening to this episode, remember that someone you know may someday hear those same terrifying words. Your empathy, your presence, and your understanding may become one of the most powerful gifts you can offer them. And often, the most powerful response is the simplest one. I'm here with you. Not advice, not statistics, just your presence. So yes, the moment you hear the words cancer may feel like the ground has disappeared beneath your feet. Yet over time, most people gradually adapt to the reality of living with cancer. The early chaos becomes structured routines, appointments, treatments, recovery periods, and eventually survivorship. But regardless, the diagnosis moment often remains a powerful emotional landmark in a person's life story. So here are your reflection prompts. Number 1, think back to the moment you first heard the words, "you have cancer." What do you remember most about that moment? The room, the people, the feeling in your body? Number 2, when you look back now, what do you wish someone had told you in those first few days after diagnosis? And number 3, if you could sit beside the version of yourself who had just been diagnosed, what would you say to them now? If you like, please share your responses in the comments. Your words and experiences are powerful. And if today's episode resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might be navigating the early days of a cancer diagnosis right now. Hearing that shock is a normal human response can make those first few days feel a little less isolating. Coming up in episode 6 of the After Cancer podcast, we're talking about something many cancer survivors feel, but often aren't comfortable saying out loud: survivor guilt. What happens when your scan is clear, but someone you met in treatment doesn't make it? Why was I spared? And how do you live fully when part of your heart is still carrying the people who didn't get the same outcome? We will talk about the complicated emotions that can follow survival and how to honor the people we've lost without losing ourselves in the process. That's next time. Before we wrap up, a quick shout out to ABCD after breast cancer diagnosis. My friends over at ABCD provide free virtual personalized emotional support by matching anyone impacted by breast cancer with a trained volunteer mentor who has a similar lived experience. You can learn more about getting support or becoming a mentor at abcdbreastcancersupport.org. I'm oncology physical therapist Dr. Leslie Waltke. Thank you for joining me today. Exercise like your life depends on it, because it does. And remember, if the moment of a diagnosis changed your world, your reaction to that moment was human. You are not alone, and you belong here. Peace out. Let's talk again soon.